So some really interesting new poll numbers that, frankly, pretty troubling jumped down at me over the weekend. Let's go ahead and throw this up on the screen. So this was from CBS and YouGov. They asked, what is the biggest threat to America's way of life? And overwhelmingly, 54%, a majority of Americans said that other people in America are the biggest threat to their way of life. Economic forces is next. That they listed out like sort of like big business and trade interests, financial interests. Next up, natural disasters and viruses. Finally, foreign threats. So even in the midst of a pandemic, when thousands of people are literally being killed every day, overwhelmingly, people see their neighbors, their uncle, their friend, their cousin, the people they went to high school with. That's who they see as their biggest threat. And Sagar, this is something that we've talked about a lot. This is the thesis from Matt Taibbi and Hate Inc. that I think is so important to understand and to recognize is basically you've had for decades now a business model of the media of pitting people against each other, of turning one another into the scariest possible enemies and existential threats. And this is what you end up with ultimately. I mean, you can trace this back to Newt Gingrich was in a lot of ways a pioneer of this strategy of aggressively dividing people and painting your opponents, not just as, people who have a difference of opinion and look at things a little bit differently, but as un-American. He famously sent out a memo to the Republican caucus listing language of how to describe your opponents like anti-child, un-American. He also pioneered this strategy of using the C-SPAN cameras in the House chamber where there wouldn't even be anyone really in the chamber. And he would do all this, over the top grandstanding for the cameras. That was right at the beginning of the cable news era. So, you can see what we've wrought here. And obviously with the political violence we've seen on the streets, with the Capitol insurrection, with two factions that really feel like they don't see each other's side whatsoever. And like the other one is a complete existential threat. Every election is existential stakes. That is where we've found ourselves. So these numbers are really just confirmation that media strategy, which has been in operation now for years, has really borne some disastrous fruit for the country.
No, exactly. And the fact that in the middle of a pandemic that we still see other people, other Americans as our biggest threat, that's what scares me the most. But it actually makes sense if you think about it. It only took 9 months on cable television in order to convince falsely the American people to go to war in Iraq. How many years now? What has it been? Almost 20 years since the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, since 9/11. Actually, yeah, literally almost 20 years at this point of propaganda aimed at each other within cable news in order to hate each other. That goes deep, and it goes deep in terms of convincing everyone that each other is the problem. And again, this is something we'll talk about today on the show, but this 9/11 style commission, 9/11 style response, calling for law enforcement of criminalizing each other could not end more disastrously, because what it would mean is that you try and use the tools of the state and law enforcement in order to investigate and crush the other side while letting yours either potentially off the hook or downplaying it. And I can't overstate how dangerous that is. Trump, in many ways, is the one who did that, and by downplaying the Capitol riots and talking about a forceful response to the Black Lives Matter protests. That's not morally or ethically or, rhetorically consistent. And this is something where when we see this escalate rhetoric on both sides, it really scares the hell out of me, because at that point, in 2001 and more, we were talking about not even criminalizing, and the enemy is the other. So it was uniting the country around an external force. But when media did that same thing to talk about each other, then the logical implication of that is investigating and fighting one another. And we've never really been at a more tenuous time in America than right now, with all of our social fabric completely frayed because of this pandemic, because of the way our economy is and more. And you're right. It's some of the most troubling data that we've seen so far. And of course, nobody wants to talk about who's responsible or what can be done. Because it's all just baked in to the corporate media environment and into politics today, if we're honest.
A lot of people make a lot of money off of those numbers right there. And if you want to know where this leads, if you're actually worried about authoritarianism, that's where this leads. Because what's the logical conclusion? We've got to have a police state to keep these terrible people who I'm afraid of, whether it's I'm afraid of the ones in the cities or I'm afraid of the ones in the rural areas. We've got to keep them in check. So we've got to have this massive national security state. So yeah, you saw it in the summer, conservatives who were, freaked out by hours of cable news telling you that Black Lives Matter and Antifa was coming to your town to destroy it. Freaked out, wanting the military to come in, wanting like mass arrests and this, over the top crackdown. And you see it in this like bloodthirst online right now from liberals who want a similar sort of security state crackdown on Trump supporters, on anyone who's at the protests, and especially, look, anyone who broke the law in connection to the riots, they should face accountability. But there's this over the top bloodthirst that ultimately just leads to authoritarianism. That is literally where this heads, where the direction that this heads in. Because if you don't feel safe among your fellow citizens, if you think they're the enemy, what's the answer to that? It's a massive police state. It's Patriot Act 2.0, now fully and completely aimed at your fellow citizens to tamp out that existential threat. And everyone who has made money off of creating this situation should be absolutely ashamed of themselves, but there's no reflection there ever. So I think this is like, those numbers really reflect what the biggest challenge for this country is in the years to come. And to me, it's a big question mark whether this country is even governable at this point, given the fact that we see one another as the other, as the threat, as the villain, as the enemy. I don't know how you get past that.
Yeah, I really don't know either. It's just something I talked about with Brett Weinstein, and I was trying to give the optimistic case. I was like, well, maybe he was like, look at gun sales, right? New gun sales are the ultimate indication that you think you're going to have to use armed force in order to defend yourself, presumably against somebody else within the United States, when they're highest of all time. And this was before Biden was elected, so it's not about the idea that they're coming for you. You can't even buy ammunition in this country right now because of how much of a shortage there is. It's a reflection of there are a lot of people who think they're going to have to use deadly force against one another in order to protect themselves. And I'm not knocking gun culture or anything. I'm saying that it's the ultimate reflection of what the real mood is. And this just is downstream, I think, from some of the data that we've seen here for a long time. It's very troubling.
Well, all right, we're going to have more rising for you after this.